Tannenberg, the German triumph in the East, August 1914. The forests of East Prussia are alive with sound, the echo of guns, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men who can barely see one another through the thick pine and birch. Dust and heat choke the air. Somewhere near the village of Tannenberg, two great armies grope toward each other, blind and furious, in one of the first and most decisive clashes of the Great War. It is here that the fate of the Eastern Front will be sealed, and the legend of the German army reborn. When the war began, the Russian Empire moved faster than anyone expected. Mobilization, long thought impossible within weeks, was achieved in days. By mid-August, two massive Russian forces, the First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf and the Second under General Alexander Samsonov, crossed into East Prussia. Their objective was simple: crush Germany's eastern provinces before the bulk of its army could return from France. If they succeeded, Berlin itself would be threatened within months. For the German High Command, already stretched to the limit by the invasion of Belgium and the advance on Paris, it was a nightmare scenario. Command in the east had been given to the aging General Maximilian von Prittwitz, an officer of the old school who viewed the coming campaign with dread. He commanded only the 8th Army, roughly 150,000 men, against two Russian armies totaling over 250,000. "We are outnumbered," he told his staff, "and surrounded by forests that favor the enemy." The first clashes confirmed his fears. On August 17th, Rennenkampf's First Army struck at Gumbinnen, defeating the Germans in a sharp engagement that sent Prittwitz reeling. In panic, he telegraphed Berlin with a desperate proposal: abandon East Prussia entirely and retreat behind the Vistula. That message was received in the headquarters of the German General Staff with outrage. Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, Chief of Staff, dismissed Prittwitz on the spot. His replacement would become one of the most formidable partnerships in modern military history, General Paul von Hindenburg, called from retirement, and his Chief of Staff, the brilliant and ruthless Colonel Erich Ludendorff. When Hindenburg arrived at the front on August 23rd, the situation was dire. Rennenkampf's forces advanced from the east, while Samsonov's Second Army, moving from the south, threatened to encircle the Germans completely. The roads were choked with refugees, the fields burning from artillery fire. Yet in the chaos, Ludendorff saw opportunity. Russian communication was primitive, unsecured radio transmissions sent without encryption, and German intercept units were listening. Within hours of arrival, Hindenburg's new staff knew the positions and intentions of both Russian armies almost in real time. What followed would become one of the most masterful encirclements in modern warfare. Hindenburg and Ludendorff moved quickly. Instead of retreating west, they decided to strike south against Samsonov's army before Rennenkampf could unite with him. To achieve this, they needed mobility and luck. Using East Prussia's extensive railway network, they shifted nearly the entire 8th Army westward, then pivoted it south in a vast hidden movement. Train after train rolled through the night, soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, unaware of the scale of the gamble being taken. By August 26th, Samsonov's Second Army had advanced deep into German territory, unaware that the 8th Army had vanished from its front. The Russians' supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Communication with Rennenkampf was non-existent. The dense forests and poor roads isolated units from one another. Russian soldiers, marching through heat and dust, were exhausted and starving. When their scouts reported minor German forces ahead, Samsonov pressed forward, confident of victory. He did not realize that the trap was already closing. At dawn on August 27th, German artillery opened fire along a 30-mile front near the villages of Ustau and Allenstein. The Russian center reeled. German infantry poured forward, advancing through forests and across open fields under the cover of precise, concentrated fire. To the east, General Hermann von François, 1st Corps, struck Samsonov's left flank with ferocious discipline, capturing the key railway junction at Waplitz. To the west, General von Mackensen's 16th Corps swung wide, cutting off the Russian retreat. Within 24 hours, Samsonov's army was surrounded. For the Russian soldiers trapped inside the encirclement, the next 2 days were a nightmare. Under relentless shelling, whole regiments broke and fled into the woods. Russian officers tried to rally their men, but confusion reigned. The roads were jammed with wounded, supply wagons overturned, horses dying in the ditches. The German advance pressed from all sides, closing the pocket tighter by the hour. Samsonov rode from position to position, attempting to restore order, but it was hopeless. His corps commanders had lost contact. Some units fought in isolation, others surrendered without firing a shot. On August 29th, surrounded near the village of Willenberg, Samsonov realized that his army no longer existed as a fighting force. In despair, he retreated into a nearby forest with his staff, dismounted, and shot himself. His body would not be found for days. When the firing finally ceased, the scale of the catastrophe stunned even the victors. The Germans had captured more than 90,000 Russian prisoners, seized hundreds of guns, and annihilated Samsonov's Second Army. Fewer than 10,000 Russians escaped. The battlefield was littered with wreckage, rifles, broken carts, and the bodies of men who had marched to their deaths in silence. News of the victory reached Berlin within hours. The High Command ordered the engagement renamed the Battle of Tannenberg, invoking the memory of the medieval 1410 battle in which the Teutonic Knights had been defeated by Slavic forces. Now, centuries later, the symbolism was reversed. The German army had avenged its ancestors. Across Germany, church bells rang, and newspapers declared Hindenburg and Ludendorff heroes. The psychological impact was immense. Just as the Battle of the Marne had saved France in the west, Tannenberg had saved Germany in the east. The threat to Prussia was gone, and with it, the fear of a two-front collapse. Yet beneath the triumph, a darker truth lay hidden. The victory at Tannenberg owed as much to Russian failure as to German genius. Failures of command, communication, and coordination that would haunt Russia for the rest of the war. In the aftermath of the slaughter, East Prussia was transformed into a graveyard of two armies. The roads near Allenstein and Neidenberg were lined with burned wagons, smashed field guns, and the unburied dead. German soldiers wandered among heaps of discarded Russian rifles, stunned by the scale of their own success. Prisoners marched in endless columns toward the railheads, gaunt, silent, eyes downcast. Many had thrown away their boots to march barefoot through the dust. "We did not fight," one captured Russian officer murmured to his guard. "We were hunted." For Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the victory was total, but not yet complete. Reports indicated that remnants of Samsonov's shattered corps were retreating eastward, attempting to regroup with Rennenkampf's First Army. Ludendorff insisted on immediate pursuit. The German Eighth Army, exhausted but elated, pivoted east once again. Using the same rail lines that had carried them south days earlier, they now swung north to face Rennenkampf head-on. The coordination was astonishing. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of guns, all moved in precise order by train and foot. By August 31st, the Germans were attacking again. Rennenkampf, unaware of Samsonov's destruction, advanced cautiously from the east. His army had fought at Gumbinnen and believed the Germans were still retreating. When Russian scouts finally learned that the Second Army had vanished, panic spread. By the time the Germans struck near the lakes of Masuria, Rennenkampf's formations were already fraying. The Second Army's defeat left his right flank completely exposed, and with German cavalry cutting his communications, he had little choice but to withdraw. By September 3rd, the Russians were in full retreat back across their own frontier. The campaign in East Prussia was over. The combined battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes cost Russia more than 170,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans lost fewer than 20,000. It was one of the most one-sided victories in modern history, and its consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Petrograd, news of the disaster stunned the Russian government. Crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace, demanding explanations. The press condemned the generals for incompetence. Whispers of treachery spread through the army. Tsar Nicholas II, deeply shaken, removed several senior officers and vowed to take personal command of the army, a decision that would later prove catastrophic. Among the German high command, triumph bordered on euphoria. Hindenburg was promoted to field marshal and became an overnight national hero, his stern face appearing in newspapers and postcards across the empire. Ludendorff, though officially subordinate, emerged as the real architect of the victory, the calculating mind behind the maneuver. Together, they became the symbols of German resilience, their names fused into a single legend, Hindenburg Ludendorff, the saviors of the East. The propaganda value of Tannenberg was incalculable. Coming just weeks after the shock of the Marne, it reassured a nation that the war was still winnable. School children memorized the numbers of prisoners taken. Newspapers spoke of divine justice. In the small Prussian town of Hohenstein, the German army built a massive wooden cross over Samsonov's burial site, a rare gesture of respect amid victory. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the medieval battle from which the new one took its name. The Teutonic Knights had been crushed by Slavic armies on this soil in 1410. Now, in 1914, Germany had avenged that defeat with near-surgical precision. Behind the glory, the strategic reality was more complex. Tannenberg had saved East Prussia, but could not alter the broader balance of the war. Germany remained locked in stalemate in the west, its armies pinned from the Channel to the Vosges. In the east, Russia still fielded vast forces, battered but not broken. Even as Hindenburg's men marched in victory parades, new Russian divisions were assembling along the Niemen River. The Eastern Front would stretch for another 1,000 miles, and another 4 years, consuming millions more lives. For now, however, East Prussia exhaled. Villages that had burned days earlier raised German flags once more. Civilians returned to ruins that had once been their homes. In the town of Ortelsburg, a farmer wrote, "The Russians came and took everything. The Germans came and gave us hope." The region became a symbol of national endurance, proof that the fatherland could defend itself even when outnumbered. Yet the human cost lingered. Burial parties worked for weeks, covering the fallen in shallow graves. The summer heat turned the fields foul with decay. Letters from German soldiers reveal little triumph and much weariness. "We have beaten them," one corporal wrote. "But the earth smells of death and victory together." For the Russian prisoners, the journey west was a march into silence. Thousands died of hunger and disease before reaching the camps. Those who survived would not see home again until after the war, if at all. In Berlin, the General Staff dissected the campaign with clinical pride. They credited radio intercepts, mobility, and discipline, all true, but overlooked the deeper causes: Russian overconfidence, poor coordination, and the fatal separation of Rennenkampf and Samsonov. The two generals, personally hostile to each other after a feud dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, had refused to cooperate. Their rivalry had doomed an army. To the Germans, it seemed as though their enemies had done half the work for them. Ludendorff understood this better than anyone. "The victory," he later wrote, "was born of the enemy's mistakes, but we were ready to seize them." His meticulous staff planning, coupled with Hindenburg's calm authority, created a dynamic that would shape German strategy for the rest of the war. The pair would go on to command the entire Eastern Front and eventually the German war effort itself, ruling with near dictatorial power. Tannenberg was their genesis, their moment of creation. By September's end, the front lines in East Prussia were quiet once again. The fields where Samsonov's army had perished lay strewn with wreckage. The forests whispered with wind and the sound of crows circling overhead. The campaign that had begun with panic and retreat had ended in triumph so complete that it seemed mythic. Yet those who stood amid the ruins knew what it had cost and what it had begun. The war on the Eastern Front was only starting, and the machine that had triumphed at Tannenberg would soon turn its iron toward Poland, the Baltics, and beyond. The victory at Tannenberg changed not only the course of the Eastern Front, but also the psychology of both empires that fought it. For Germany, it was a resurrection, proof that the nation's discipline and intellect could prevail even when outnumbered. For Russia, it was a humiliation so deep it cut into the empire's faith in itself. In the weeks following the battle, Hindenburg and Ludendorff wasted no time consolidating their success. Their armies, reinvigorated by triumph, advanced eastward to secure the Masurian lakes. Once again, German tactics emphasized precision and coordination. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, they maneuvered with speed, using the rail network like a sword. Their flanks moved in harmony, cutting off retreat paths before the Russians could regroup. The result was another devastating defeat for the Russian forces still reeling from Tannenberg. By mid-September 1914, East Prussia was entirely clear of enemy troops. From their new headquarters in the town of Marienburg, Hindenburg and Ludendorff established what became a model of military efficiency. Orders were concise, communications centralized, and reconnaissance relentless. Aerial scouts flew daily missions over Russian lines, mapping every movement. Wireless intercepts continued to reveal Russian plans with stunning accuracy. "It is as if the enemy fights with an open book," one German staff officer noted. The Russians, despite catastrophic losses, still relied on unsecured radio transmissions, their codebooks unfinished, their signals broadcast in plain language. Yet for all their tactical brilliance, the Germans faced a strategic dilemma. The bulk of their army, and their resources, remained locked in the west. Moltke could not spare reinforcements without endangering the Western Front, where the French and British were entrenched after the Marne. The Eighth Army therefore had to hold East Prussia alone against an enemy that, even after Tannenberg, outnumbered it 3-1. It was a victory that demanded constant vigilance. On the Russian side, chaos reigned. News of Samsonov's suicide spread quickly through the ranks. Officers whispered of betrayal, of German spies in Petrograd, of incompetence at the highest levels. Rennenkampf's retreat turned into a rout. Entire divisions dissolved as soldiers abandoned weapons and fled eastward. The Tsar's generals, already divided by rivalry, turned on each other in blame. In the capital, Duma deputies demanded accountability. Newspapers, once censored, now printed lists of the dead. "The army bleeds," one headline read, "and no one commands." The effect on morale was catastrophic. Russian soldiers began to doubt not only their leaders, but the war itself. The myth of the invincible empire, the steamroller of the East, collapsed overnight. Peasants conscripted from Siberia and the Volga now spoke openly of going home. The officer corps, drawn from nobility, despised the incompetence of the war ministry, but could not challenge it. Out of this despair, a slow, corrosive anger began to spread. The first tremor of the revolution that would erupt 3 years later. Meanwhile, in Germany, Tannenberg was turned into legend. Newspapers serialized Hindenburg's exploits, artists painted heroic portraits, and children were taught to memorize his name. Streets were renamed in his honor, and postcards showed him standing like a giant above the forests of East Prussia. For a nation under siege in the West, the story of Tannenberg became a moral weapon, proof that divine destiny still favored the Reich. The Kaiser visited the front personally to award medals, calling Hindenburg the shield of Germany. The real architect, Ludendorff, remained in the background, tireless and methodical. His vision of warfare, total, organized and mechanical, was taking form. He saw the battle not as a victory of courage, but of system. "Modern war," he wrote later, "is mathematics conducted with blood." His logistical methods, his obsession with centralized control, and his belief in industrialized mobilization would later define Germany's entire war effort. The Russians tried to recover. Reinforcements poured in from the interior, and Grand Duke Nicholas, commander-in-chief, sought to restore morale with patriotic appeals. "Remember the motherland," he told his troops. But memory was a poor defense against artillery. When the Germans attacked again at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes in early September, Russian units collapsed once more, losing another 100,000 men. Winter came early to the forests of East Prussia, and with it, the first real stalemate on the Eastern Front. The strategic outcome of Tannenberg went far beyond territory. It shaped every decision in Berlin for the rest of the war. Convinced that Hindenburg and Ludendorff could repeat their miracle anywhere, the Kaiser entrusted them with ever greater authority. By 1916, the pair effectively controlled the German war machine. Their confidence, born at Tannenberg, would later harden into arrogance, leading them to push for unrestricted submarine warfare, total mobilization, and ultimately, national exhaustion. For Russia, Tannenberg marked the beginning of a downward spiral. The empire's logistical weaknesses, its lack of railways, munitions, and unified command, had been exposed for all to see. Every subsequent campaign carried the shadow of that defeat. Even when Russian forces won temporary victories in Galicia or the Carpathians, the ghost of Samsonov's army haunted their triumphs. "Remember Tannenberg," soldiers muttered before each attack, not as inspiration, but as warning. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine continued to build the myth. Plans were drawn to erect a monument, a vast stone memorial complex that would rise on the battlefield itself. Construction began in 1924 and would take a decade, culminating in the Tannenberg Memorial, a fortress-like structure meant to enshrine the victory for eternity. When Hindenburg died in 1934, his body was placed within it, sealing the myth of the battle into national identity. But in 1914, none of that yet existed. Only the fields remained. Quiet now, scarred by craters and shallow graves. The lakes glimmered in the autumn sun, reflecting a sky emptied of smoke. For the German soldiers resting on the ridges, it felt as though history itself had turned in their favor. They could not know that this triumph, born of intelligence and precision, would one day fuel ambitions that would consume their nation. In the stillness that followed, local villagers began to return. They found their barns burned, their wells fouled, and the forests filled with bodies. The Russian dead numbered in the tens of thousands. German burial teams worked for months, stacking the fallen in communal pits marked only by wooden crosses. The landscape that had once been green turned grey under the weight of memory. The Battle of Tannenberg was more than a tactical masterpiece. It was a moral event, a collision of pride, vengeance, and fate. Germany's faith in its own efficiency, Russia's faith in its own vastness, both met here in the forests of East Prussia, and only one survived. By October 1914, East Prussia had returned to uneasy quiet. The fields where Samsonov's men had died were now marked by wooden stakes and blackened debris. German villagers emerged from hiding to find their homes looted and their livestock slaughtered. Churches were pocked with shrapnel. Schoolhouses had become field hospitals. But amid the wreckage, the German army stood triumphant. They had done what seemed impossible: crushed 2 Russian armies in a single campaign, preserved their homeland, and restored confidence to a shaken empire. At the 8th Army's headquarters in Marienburg, Hindenburg and Ludendorff reviewed the final reports. 92,000 prisoners taken, 600 guns captured, tens of thousands of rifles, wagons, and animals seized. The Russian Second Army had ceased to exist. Their staff officers pored over maps covered in pencil marks and casualty figures, realizing they had achieved not only victory, but annihilation. Hindenburg, stoic as ever, merely nodded. "It is done," he said quietly. To his soldiers, he became a figure of myth, the calm father of the front, unflinching and precise. Ludendorff, by contrast, was tireless, moving from unit to unit with boundless energy, issuing orders deep into the night. Together they embodied the dual face of German power, patience and precision. In Berlin, the Kaiser received the news with elation. The reports from the west had been grim. The advance toward Paris stalled, the Marne lost. But Tannenberg offered redemption. The Kaiser wired Hindenburg, "You have saved the East, and with it the honor of the German army." Across the empire, bells rang, schools closed for celebration, and soldiers on leave were greeted as heroes. Newspapers printed vivid illustrations of the battle, showing Samsonov's army swallowed by arrows and encircled lines. The myth grew faster than the truth. Tannenberg was not merely a victory, it was a narrative, one that told a wounded nation it could still shape destiny through will and order. For the Russian Empire, the psychological collapse was profound. In Petrograd, the Duma fell into chaos. Reports from the front were conflicting, but one fact was undeniable: an entire army had vanished. Families received telegrams that simply read, "Missing." Rumors spread that the generals had betrayed the Tsar, or that German officers had infiltrated Russian headquarters. None of it was true, but in a country already brittle with distrust, the loss fed resentment against both the monarchy and the military elite. The Tsar's decision later that year to assume personal command of the army stemmed directly from this humiliation. His presence was meant to restore morale, but it would tie his fate to the war's inevitable disasters. In the months that followed, Hindenburg and Ludendorff's reputations soared. They were hailed as the saviors of East Prussia, the men who had restored the empire's pride. Propaganda transformed them into near saints. Their portraits hung in schools and shops. Hindenburg's heavy frame and impassive face became the icon of steadfastness. Ludendorff's sharp gaze and restless energy symbolized modern genius. They became inseparable, the iron duo. Every success on the Eastern Front, from the Masurian Lakes to Gorlich's Tarnów, would be credited to their partnership. But victory also brought illusion. The ease with which they had destroyed Samsonov's army convinced many in Berlin that Germany could outthink and outmaneuver any opponent. The lesson of Tannenberg, that wars could be won through intellect, precision, and willpower, became dogma. Few understood that such victories were rare and unrepeatable. The Russians, though bloodied, were not broken. Within months, new armies filled the void, stretching the German lines thin once more. The Eastern Front would expand into an endless war of movement and attrition, consuming men and materiel that Germany could ill afford. On the ground, the consequences were immediate and grim. The battlefield became a vast open wound. German burial teams dug trenches not for defense, but for the dead. Priests walked among the fallen reading prayers in both languages. Russian corpses lay in heaps where they had been mowed down trying to break through the encirclement. The stench of decay filled the forests for weeks. Villagers collecting firewood stumbled upon skeletons long after the fighting ended. The land itself seemed unable to forget. The victory also left behind a bitter paradox. For all its tactical brilliance, Tannenberg changed nothing fundamental about the war's direction. The Western Front remained stalemated, and the Eastern Front, though momentarily stabilized, demanded constant reinforcement. The German army, celebrated for its efficiency, was now bound to an ever-expanding conflict it could not escape. Tannenberg, for all its glory, had not shortened the war. It had made it endless. Still, to the soldiers who fought there, the memory endured. Veterans spoke of the eerie silence after the final gunfire, the black smoke rising above the forests, and the thousands of captured Russians standing wordlessly in the fields. "We felt both pride and pity," one lieutenant recalled. "Pride that we had done our duty. Pity that so many men had died so far from home." Tannenberg remains one of the clearest mirrors of the Great War's contradictions. A perfect victory born in an imperfect world. It was a triumph of organization, intelligence, and willpower, yet it revealed the very qualities that would later doom Europe. Faith in machines, obedience to authority, and belief in destiny through destruction. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had proven that intellect could replace numbers, that precision could conquer chaos. But they also showed how easily success could become mythology, and mythology, obsession. For Germany, the battle became a legend of salvation. For Russia, it became a wound that never healed. Samsonov's body, buried beneath the forests of East Prussia, symbolized more than defeat. It marked the beginning of the empire's unraveling. The men who had marched under the Tsar's banners now doubted both his wisdom and his war. Within 3 years, their disillusionment would ignite revolution, and the empire that had lost at Tannenberg would vanish from history. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, lifted by their triumph, rose to power beyond the battlefield. They would later shape not just armies but nations, guiding Germany toward the same total war logic that had given them victory. The machinery of efficiency that encircled Samsonov's army would one day turn inward, devouring Germany itself. Yet for all its portent, Tannenberg also stands as a testament to human will, to the capacity for discipline, coordination, and belief amid chaos. It was the last moment in modern war when intellect seemed capable of mastering fate. After Tannenberg, the war grew larger than men, a machine of its own momentum. Today, the forests of northern Poland have reclaimed the ground where the armies met. The graves are hidden beneath grass and shadow. The lakes shimmer, silent witnesses to the battle that made legends and ghosts in equal measure. Tannenberg was, as the Germans called it, der Sieg im Osten, the victory in the East. But history remembers it differently, as the warning that genius without mercy and triumph without restraint can be the beginning of the end.